When I got back from a week-long work trip, the last thing I expected was a voicemail from a neighbor telling me the HOA had secured something from my property. I wasn't even a member of their HOA. I didn't pay dues, didn't attend meetings, didn't even live under their rules. But when I opened my storage room and saw the empty shelves where my locked, legally owned firearms had been, everything inside me went cold. They didn't know I was a former officer. They didn't know what laws they'd just broken. And they definitely didn't know what was coming next. So why did an HOA think they had the right to steal from someone who wasn't even theirs to control? Before any of this started, my life was about as quiet and predictable as you could imagine. After 20 years in law enforcement, I had finally stepped back from the constant pressure, the late night calls, and the weight of responsibility that never really left your shoulders. I bought a modest home just outside a suburban community, close enough to stores and main roads, far enough away from the noise. Most importantly, it wasn't under any HOA. That detail mattered more than I realized at the time. The neighborhood I lived near was one of those manicured, cookie-cutter places with white fences, identical mailboxes, and people who waved a little too stiffly. I drove past it whenever I left for work or ran errands. Watching the same homeowners walk the same morning routes with their dogs, or gather near the community newsletter board to discuss whatever rule they were enforcing that week. I didn't pay much attention. Their world wasn't mine. And honestly, I was fine with that. My home sat just outside their boundary, literally steps from the HOA line. My property tax bill said, unincorporated, and that was exactly how I liked it. The only real connection was that we used the same access road, which the HOA sometimes behaved as if they owned. But other than a few passive-aggressive glances from board members who didn't appreciate my truck parked too close to their entrance, I kept to myself. My daily routine was simple. Mornings on the back porch with coffee, afternoons working part-time as a security consultant for small businesses, evenings tinkering in my garage or checking on the small storage room behind my house where I kept locked equipment, including my personal firearms. After retiring from the force, I held onto a few pieces I'd collected over the years, all legally stored, all locked, and all carefully maintained. They weren't trophies. They were part of my history, reminders of things I'd survived, and tools I still kept trained with in case I ever needed them. Life felt steady, maybe even peaceful. For once, I wasn't dealing with people's worst decisions. I wasn't navigating red tape or stepping into dangerous situations. I was finally breathing. But looking back, there were signs that this calm wasn't going to last. The first hint came in the form of an HOA newsletter someone slipped mistakenly, or intentionally, into my mailbox. It was full of the usual things: lawn standards, pool hours, and strict warnings about improper storage of dangerous items. One line in particular stood out. It stated that the board would begin proactive enforcement of safety regulations, including any hazardous possessions that may pose a risk to the community. I remember setting the newsletter aside with a shrug. It didn't apply to me. Their rules had no legal weight beyond their own borders. But the wording felt overreaching. A little too confident, as if they believed their authority extended further than it actually did. Another subtle warning came a week before my trip, when a neighbor knocked, the sort who always tried to gather information while pretending to just chat. He mentioned the HOA had been discussing non-compliant properties, and that my place was coming up a lot lately. I dismissed it as nosy gossip. The HOA had no jurisdiction, and I had no obligation to care what they said behind gated community walls. Still, it lingered in the back of my mind. Then there was the afternoon I noticed two HOA board members standing at the edge of my driveway, pointing toward my storage room. They didn't see me watching from the garage. They took pictures, spoke in hushed voices, and left without addressing me. I assumed they were just cataloging something for their internal drama. Later, when I walked down to the area they'd been inspecting, nothing seemed out of place. The lock on my storage door was intact. My property line was unchanged. They had no business being there, but I chalked it up to nosiness. It was only when I left town for my consulting trip, a simple 3-day job that turned into a week, that everything started unraveling. I had double-checked my home before leaving, as I always did. Doors locked, security system armed, storage room sealed. My cameras were motion-triggered and backed up to cloud storage. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen while I was gone, but the HOA saw my absence as an opportunity. At the time, I had no idea they'd been holding secret committee discussions about community safety concerns, or that my proximity to their property line made me a target of their overzealous enforcement. I didn't know they had convinced themselves that the storage building on my land fell under their extended safety oversight zone. It sounded absurd, but that was the kind of bureaucracy they thrived on. Inventing rules where none existed, twisting language to justify behavior they had no right to engage in. While I was hundreds of miles away working, they were planning something that would turn my quiet post-retirement life into a storm of violation, disbelief, and legal chaos. And it all started with their obsession with control. In their minds, I wasn't someone living outside their boundaries. I was a non-compliant neighbor, a threat to their perfectly curated image, a property they wanted to regulate, whether I agreed or not. But the moment they decided to cross that invisible line and step onto my land without permission, they set in motion a chain of events they were utterly unprepared for. They just didn't know it yet. The Homeowners Association believed they were the ultimate authority in the area. What they didn't realize was that I spent my entire career upholding the actual law. And I understood every single right they were about to violate. Soon, they were going to learn exactly what it meant to target the wrong person. And everything they took from my property would become the evidence that uncovered their biggest mistake. When my plane landed after a week away, the first thing I did was check my phone. A handful of texts from coworkers, a missed call from my sister, and then, buried between notifications, a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, just a nearby area code. I pressed play as I walked through the terminal, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. Instead, a nervous voice said they weren't trying to get involved, but thought I should know the HOA had been on my property all week, claiming there were dangerous materials in that back storage room. Then they hung up abruptly, as if afraid to be caught leaving the message. My stomach dropped. I stopped walking. The noise of the airport blurred into background static as the words replayed in my head. On my property. All week. I knew I'd locked everything before I left. My cameras should have detected anyone approaching. Yet, when I tried to load the footage, the app spun in a loading circle before showing a message I had never seen before: device offline. My security system had been tampered with. I got in my truck and drove straight home. The calm suburban road that usually felt peaceful now filled with a creeping sense of violation. As I passed the HOA entrance, a board member standing near the gate gave me a glance. Not the cold, passive stare I was used to, but something else. Something like satisfaction. Like they knew something I didn't. When I finally pulled into my property and stepped out, I noticed small details instantly. Grass disturbed in places it shouldn't be. Tire tracks near the back. Footprints in the dirt. My motion lights, set to stay steady, flickered strangely, like someone had messed with their wiring. Heart pounding, I walked toward the storage room. The lock was gone. Not broken. Not cut, just replaced. A different finish. A different brand. Installed with clean precision. That was the moment I knew this wasn't kids trespassing or a curious neighbor poking around. Someone had gained access deliberately. And the only group bold enough to act like they owned everything around here was the HOA. I bolted back to my house, grabbed the spare key for the original lock. The lock that was no longer there. And tried the door. Of course, it didn't fit. My jaw clenched as I tried to steady my breath. I had dealt with break-ins before, but this was my home. My sanctuary. My private property, invaded. I forced the door open with a crowbar, and when it finally gave, a hollow echo met me. The shelves were empty. Every firearm case, every box of stored equipment, every item I had logged, cleaned, and maintained. Gone. Not misplaced. Not rummaged through. Gone. The sight hit me harder than I expected. These weren't just tools. They represented years of service, memories of partners who had my back, and pieces of my identity I kept because they mattered to me. And now they were missing, taken by people with no legal authority over me or my property. As I scanned the room, something caught my eye. A laminated paper taped to the wall. A notice of safety confiscation, with the HOA's logo printed at the top like they were some sort of official agency. My name was spelled wrong. My address was listed as if it were part of their community, and the justification section said my property fell under an extended safety zone, meant to protect residents from hazardous materials not stored in compliance with HOA policy. They had invented a reason to take things they had no right to even touch. My hands shook with anger. In any other situation, I would have immediately called the police. But I was the police. Or I used to be. And I knew exactly what kind of mess this could turn into if handled poorly. Reporting stolen firearms wasn't just a simple property theft claim. It triggered federal-level protocols, investigations, and accountability that the HOA clearly hadn't considered before acting. I walked out of the room and looked toward the HOA neighborhood, trying to piece together how far they had gone, and that was when I saw a small team of HOA volunteers walking door to door, holding clipboards and handing out papers. One of them glanced toward my house, then quickly looked away. They had no idea I was home yet. Inside my living room, I opened my laptop and accessed my security backups. The cloud storage had partial clips, time-stamped sequences of figures approaching my property late at night, blocking sensors, and then disabling cameras. They wore reflective vests. They carried bolt cutters and lock kits. Some even wore badges with the HOA's emblem. Like they were performing some sanctioned operation. Every second of footage made my blood boil hotter. The HOA had coordinated a seizure like it was some official raid, disguising rule enforcement as lawful authority. And they didn't stop at breaking in. They cut power to my cameras, entered the storage room, removed items, loaded them into HOA utility carts, and drove away. And the strangest detail. They handled everything like they were terrified. Hurried movements, nervous glances, arguments among themselves. This wasn't the confidence of rule enforcers. This was the panic of people who knew they were doing something illegal and hoped no one would notice. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I printed the footage clips, the fake notice, and screenshots from my camera logs. Then I walked toward the HOA office building near their pool, a place I had never stepped foot in until now. As I approached, a board member hurried inside, closing the door behind them. Through the glass, I saw people pulling out binders, whispering frantically, and pointing toward my house as if the world had just started burning. When I reached the office door, a sign hung on it, "Closed for private HOA meeting." But through the window blinds, I saw movement. I knocked once, firmly. The room froze. Someone peeked through a crack in the blinds before pulling them shut. They were hiding. But hiding meant guilt, and guilt meant leverage. I turned away, knowing the confrontation was coming. But waiting for them to open the door would only waste time. I had the footage. I had the physical break in evidence. I had everything needed to involve the sheriff's department. But there was something else I needed first. Confirmation of where they had taken my belongings. I walked along the HOA's service path, an area lined with maintenance sheds, reserved for landscaping equipment. The gates were locked. But the locks matched the same brand as the one they had installed on my storage room. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. The rising tension seemed to thicken the air itself. As I approached the last shed in the row, a faint metallic clink echoed from inside. Someone was moving things, items, equipment, cases. My pulse hammered as I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Shuffling, soft curses, the unmistakable sound of metal on metal. Heavy objects being stacked. I scanned the hinges, looked for weak points, and found a far too new padlock. The HOA had been busy, changing locks like they were preparing for war. I didn't break it. I didn't need to. As I stepped back, someone inside shifted too close to the door, and through a small ventilation slit, I saw it, the corner of one of my firearm cases, still marked with my old precinct number. My property. Right there. My jaw tightened as the reality hit me fully. The HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were actively concealing what they'd taken. Covering their tracks. Creating a narrative. Trying to make sure I never saw what belonged to me again. But the more they tried to hide, the more evidence they created. And I knew exactly how to use it. I took a steadying breath and snapped photos through the cases, the labels, the layout. This was the proof I needed to drag their whole operation into the light. As I walked away from the shed, the HOA president herself rounded the corner, nearly colliding with me. Her face drained of color the moment she recognized me. She opened her mouth to speak, but I simply held up the printed footage. Her expression tightened with fear. She took one step back. Then another. She knew everything was about to explode. But she had no idea just how big the explosion would be, because the next move wasn't happening on a sidewalk. It wasn't happening in a private meeting or through a petty HOA notice. It was happening in a place where they didn't get to twist rules or hide behind community bylaws. The next step was law. Real law. And they were about to learn exactly what it felt like to wage a power game against someone who had enforced the real thing his entire career. The moment I dialed the sheriff's department, everything changed. And what happened that afternoon would become the turning point. The moment this HOA's desperate attempts to control everything came crashing down. But before everything unfolded, there was one more twist they didn't see coming. One that would make everything far, far worse for them. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, the HOA neighborhood had already transformed from its usual picture. Perfect postcard into a nest of frantic motion. Homeowners peeked through blinds. Board members hurried across lawns with binders clutched to their chests. The HOA president stood near the entrance with her arms crossed tight, pacing in small, agitated circles as if she could somehow control the outcome of what was coming. But, for the first time, the outcome was no longer in their hands. When the deputies stepped onto my property, I could see their posture shift the moment I handed over the evidence. Printed screenshots, time-stamped footage, photos of my cases inside the HOA shed, everything laid out with precision, organized the way years on the force had trained me to document wrongdoing. They didn't ask the usual skeptical questions. They didn't minimize. They didn't hesitate. They saw the break-in for what it was: a felony. And not just any felony. One involving forced entry, tampering with security systems, theft of firearms, and attempted concealment of property. That alone would have been enough to shatter the HOA's world, but they had gone a step further by impersonating authority, issuing fake notices, and inventing non-existent zones of jurisdiction. Each detail strengthened the case. Each misstep made their actions more indefensible. When the deputies asked if I knew where the stolen property was being stored, I led them to the row of maintenance sheds. As we approached the last one, the same faint clinking of metal echoed inside. The deputy paused, radioed his team, and within seconds the HOA president arrived, breathless, trying to intercept them. She didn't get the chance. The deputies ordered her back. She froze, hands shaking, caught between her illusion of control and the reality that it was over. They demanded she produce keys. When she tried to stall, claiming it was a private community facility, the deputy informed her that the shed was now part of an active theft investigation, and failure to comply would result in obstruction charges. The HOA president's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she opened a ring of keys, fumbling through them. When the shed finally opened, the smell of metal polish and dust filled the air. Inside was the unmistakable sight of rows of storage containers. My storage containers. Stacked hastily and sloppily, some still bearing the tags I had personally labeled years ago. The deputies photographed everything. Logged the inventory, confirmed serial numbers, verified that every single item matched the missing property report I had just filed. As they worked, homeowners began gathering outside the maintenance area, not loudly, not proudly, but with the wide-eyed silence of people watching the downfall of something they once trusted. Conversations whispered through the crowd, each person trying to make sense of the chaos. That image stayed with me, a neighborhood built on control, now unraveling in real time. Once the initial report was completed, the deputies escorted every HOA board member involved in the decision to the side and questioned them separately. And that was when the unraveling became catastrophic. Because under pressure, they didn't stick together. Several board members desperately tried to distance themselves, claiming they weren't part of the confiscation, or thought it was legal, or just followed what the president ordered. But their statements contradicting one another created a web of inconsistency that only made the situation worse. The deputies documented every conflicting detail. By the time the interviews ended, the HOA president was no longer pacing. She was sitting on the curb with her head in her hands. The weight of her decisions finally hitting her. The deputies informed me that charges would be filed. Multiple charges. Against multiple individuals. And that the case would likely end up in the hands of prosecutors who did not take firearm theft lightly. As they returned my property to me piece by piece, logging each item, and ensuring proper chain of custody. The reality of what had happened settled in. The HOA's attempt to control something that was never theirs had become the very thing that dismantled their authority. But the consequences weren't even close to finished. Within a week, every homeowner in that community received notice of an emergency meeting. Not sent by the board, but by a state-appointed property manager temporarily overseeing the HOA while the investigation unfolded. The homeowners who attended found themselves sitting in folding chairs in the community center, while a legal representative explained the scope of the violations. The break-in, the theft, the impersonation of authority, the misuse of HOA funds to rent equipment and purchase lock kits, the unauthorized meetings where the board convinced themselves they had jurisdiction outside their boundaries. What shocked the homeowners most wasn't just the theft. It was the deliberate tampering with my security system. The breaking and entering. The premeditation. The room turned against the board faster than anyone expected. 30 years of petty rule enforcement and unchecked power had finally hit a brick wall, and the community's trust shattered in a single afternoon. Several homeowners demanded resignations. Others demanded refunds of their dues. Some demanded that the board members be banned from any leadership role ever again. By the end of the meeting, every member involved had stepped down. But stepping down didn't save them from the fallout. Legal consequences. The district attorney's office filed charges within 2 weeks. Charges that included criminal trespassing, theft of firearms, tampering with security devices, filing fraudulent notices, property damage, conspiracy to commit unlawful entry. Each charge carried weight. Each charge required explanation, and each charge became a public record. The HOA president faced the most severe consequences, not only for organizing the break-in but also for approving the falsified safety notice. The vice president, treasurer, and 2 enforcement officers also faced charges. The community members were stunned. Some supported the investigation. Others couldn't believe their neighbors. People they had elected had gone so far off the rails. But the strongest reaction came from those who had long suspected the board was abusing its power and were finally proven right. And as for me, I filed a civil suit for damages, security repair costs, and emotional distress. The case was almost laughably straightforward. Their own documentation, the fake notices, the fabricated policies, the emails recovered from their HOA account, supported my claims better than any lawyer could have. The settlement was substantial, enough to cover the cost of upgrading my property security several times over, restoring everything damaged during the break-in, and compensating me for the weeks of chaos that followed. For months afterward, homeowners whispered about the incident like it was a ghost story. A cautionary tale about what happens when authority goes unchecked. Signs of tension emerged everywhere. Neighbors questioned old rules, challenged decisions, demanded transparency. Attendance at HOA meetings skyrocketed now that people realized how much could go wrong behind closed doors. The community eventually voted to dissolve the original HOA board entirely and bring in a neutral management company. While rewriting their bylaws from scratch, they eliminated vague safety clauses, clarified jurisdiction boundaries, instituted mandatory review processes for any enforcement action, and most importantly, ensured that no board could ever again authorize entry onto property outside their legal oversight. It took time, but slowly, the HOA rebuilt itself into something more accountable. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And my property. It remained outside their reach, protected both by law and by the reputation the HOA now had for crossing boundaries it never should have touched. The sheriff's department returned every firearm, every piece of equipment, and every last item taken from me. But the emotional impact lingered. Having strangers invade your private space, take pieces of your personal history, and act as if they had the right to do so, it leaves a mark. But it also reignited something inside me. A sense of purpose I thought I had left behind when I hung up my badge. In the months that followed, I found myself helping other homeowners understand their rights, advising neighbors on legal processes, preventing similar abuses of authority. Word got around that I was the person to call when an HOA stepped out of line, and soon enough, people from all over town sought my advice. I never planned on becoming a resource for fighting overreaching community boards, but it happened naturally, quietly, effectively. It reminded me that even in retirement, protecting people didn't have to stop. Looking back now, the entire ordeal reveals a truth many people don't learn until it's too late. Power becomes dangerous when people think they're the only ones who deserve to hold it. The HOA believed they had authority simply because they wanted it. They believed rules mattered more than rights. They believed their fear justified stealing from someone who was never under their control in the first place. They learned differently. But the takeaway wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who has ever dealt with a person or group that confuses authority with ownership, or who thinks leadership gives them permission to overstep. Sometimes, the most important boundary you draw is the one that reminds people where their power actually ends. And sometimes, the only way to defend that boundary is to stand up, expose the truth, and let the consequences land exactly where they belong. So here's the real question. How many HOA problems would disappear overnight if people actually understood the limits of the power they claim to have?